Greetings, Marsh here, and welcome to episode 245 of my modded Factorio playthrough. In this episode, we are going to make plans for the new ore sorting machines to make our new ores. Enjoy. And we've got them down on the end, ready to go. We need to do the tier 3, the crystals, and we need to do our powders for the ore mixtures. And we've got an honorable mention right here. We've got the settings we saved for the fluorite, and we need to do those. I'm not sure if the crawler is going to be much use to us anymore. Well, it might. Might as well bring it along. Try not to crash into anything. So some stuff is going to have to move around, but we don't necessarily need to move everything, because really the only belts that are going to be moving forward are these crystal ones. So much of this can probably stay stationary if we just move these water plants somewhere else. The bigger problem will be these, because if you follow that line down, it's totally gonna chop off a major part of these. But luckily what they're producing is this methanol gas, and they are kind of piped in different ways. Like some of it's going down here and some of it's going to the left, but because it's a gas, we can basically like pick it up and maybe like throw it right here or something. So we do have some options of moving stuff around. And our factory is getting to that point now where things are getting squished, but I don't think the inconvenience of having to move these algae farms around is necessarily worth tearing all of this out and rebuilding it kind of like this. Because the problem here is that much of this space is already earmarked. Like a lot of this space right here is earmarked for potential puffer expansion. And we do kind of have a problem with the science bus is going to bump into here, so it might have to do a turn of shame like this and go like up, down, or maybe like a zigzag and just over here or something. But that's filled up. This area needs to stay open for materials expansions. This is like our expansion bus right here. And of course, this area is for the regular bus to expand. So if we were to expand our base any further, we'd basically be fighting biters and expanding the walls. And the bigger your factory becomes, the more effort that ends up being. Now there's a lot of biters, but we also have a lot better tech than we used to. So shooting the biters probably won't be the problem. It'll just take a lot of time, and I'd rather not go through that right now. So for now, we can just move stuff around as it becomes relevant, because you know, doing a next tier of ore processing is a big deal. So once we get tier 3 done, I don't think we'll have necessarily a lot of other things we'll need to do with this space, so it's kind of okay if it's a little cramped. So we need to do the fluorite, and without doing anything with Hell Mod, we can just check to see if fluorite is any faster or slower than anything else. And we compare it to silver here, and the speed is the same. It just has the interesting requirement of ferrous powder and givelite chunks. But otherwise, it's basically the exact same thing as everything here. So we need to expand, and we've got some robot parking spots right there. But there's also ones up there, but these certainly won't last. Not in this location. There's actually a lot of robots sitting there. My poor inventory. Okay, those aren't connected. It feels like they're like one square away of being able to connect, but we'll just do that. These belts right here might kind of move depending on how things go. Although it might make sense just to like throw them in between some machines, but it looks like we'll get another row here, so maybe we can just kind of leave them and not worry about it. Okay, let's put another constant combinator somewhere, just so we can get that out of the way. So we'll move those settings over there. That way we can copy one of these, and the thing it's going to be most like it. There they are, robots picking up robots. Take them back to where they go. The most similar thing is probably something like this right here. So we can just kind of copy the whole thing. And we will need some logic as well, but I think we can pop that in the end. So we come here. It basically looks like it'll fit. We'll just smash it in like everything else. Get rid of some of this extra stuff here. And we got to get that control wire continuing along. Let's cut those off because we should now have a giant line of robots. Now the robots are coming in. So we're going to need to continue the ore bus here. Probably want to make a whole bunch of hazard concrete for this. It looks like the most relevant lines are probably these ones. So we'll just come over to here. And then we'll see what it looks like later. And luckily everything still lines up. So we need to put in the ferrous and the givelite chunks. Make sure we get the exact kind. And the ferrous powder is the tier 2, which is right here. And there's no logic or anything hooked up to this. Because the demand is fairly low, it probably won't come up. But if it does, we can deal with that. And this is going to be 30 acid a second, which is probably more than we have any hope of ever using. But it's good to be prepared. And probably should have the bots delivering us lots and lots of belts. Oops. So let's grab this and I don't know, like 1,000 for now. So I feel like we need lots of belts. So the other element is the givelite chunks, which are all the way down here, which we can extend a bit. And funnily enough, there's some track that's pretty in the way, and we can't go under the track, so we'll just go around it. This is the last chunk item that's going to be coming through here, so this ought to work okay. I'd rather not move a bunch of stuff around. And then we gotta line this up. Do it in the same way as the other ones. Out of belts just at the important moment, but I guess it'll connect eventually. When the robots get here. And look at that, they're here. Let's just connect it down so it goes through. Set these to fluorite. And we'll need to have some logic up here. But we can figure that out later once we've have everything else, and we can just kind of copy them all together. So let's wait till the modules get here so we can test it for real. And then we need to extend the machines over here a little bit. We'll need to move some power poles, but we can review what kind of sorting we need to do. For now, we won't have any catalyst sorting because we need to wait until the next tier to be able to use the hybrid catalyst for things. So that makes this a little easier, because whenever you have a new tier of something, you just do the direct sorting by sorting the crystals themselves to get what you want. So we're going to need 6 lines, 1 for every color, plus an additional 2 for the dusts. And depending on what is getting sorted, we have different numbers. So you see fluorite here is doing 2 belts of input and 2 belts of output. But fluorite might not be the best example because it's an acid, but we can go with something like silicon here, where it's 2 belts go in, 2 belts come out, and then there's 1 yellow belt of catalyst in the middle. And the reason is because when you have 2 red belts of output, it takes 1 yellow belt of catalyst to make it work. So, 1/4 of the total output. And basically any sorting type that is using catalyst to directly create something, we have 2 belts of output. The reason being is that's the most efficient way of processing that ore. So we've picked that one to be the best one, and thus it gets double production to try to make sure that runs as much as possible. The lesser methods of production, the ones that just sort the resource itself without any catalyst, is less desirable, so just 1 belt of input. Because after all, this whole bus is only creating one belt of any given resource. So the reason why we can do 2 belts of something like silicon is because it has 2 separate inputs. And between the 2, we would have the 60 necessary to run it. Otherwise, the rest of the ore bus is set up based on 1 belt, so that's what we should continue to use. And the same also applies to the mixtures, that although they are a special ore type, we're still only making 1 belt of each because we have our 6 belts of colors that go in, and then some bypasses. So in the end, we have 6 belts of the different tiers and colors. So 6 belts go in and 6 belts go out. So we still have to stick to the 1 belt per color thing there. So in short, we basically have this line of sorting types to do right here. So we have 8 colors and 8 belts worth. So in other words, 4 groups of machines, since they're in pairs. And the style of the machine would be similar to something like this, where it's just 1 belt going in, and it's got any potential controls right here. So let's try to move some of these poles around. We're definitely going to want to create some space here. So let's just help the robots a little bit. And then with that, that should be a pretty clear area. So let's grab something representative. I feel like we can put the robots in after the fact. So we'll come up here, and we'll skip the logic again for now, because we can put that in the end once we've got everything down. So we'll grab the power poles and come down, and maybe grab it to here. And then it's a question of just starting to place them. We probably want to leave some space for the road. We did leave it here. It's not a specific amount of space. You see that it's not like this exactly fits there. We just kind of went with something. So we should do the same here, just kind of go with something. And these belts kind of need to come down here because this is where all of the slag goes. And it looks like we are finally building up slag. I see it's at like 58,000. We're actually building up a little bit of stone too, so that's good to see. That since this has been unhooked, that things seem like they're working okay now, so maybe that was an unnecessary setup. It is useful sometimes to be able to grind slag, but usually slag is more valuable than the stone is. So a lot of times it's not something you really need or want to do, but we'll see over time how that works, but it seems like it's getting better, so that's good. But one other thing I haven't really considered yet is that as we add more lines here, that this ore bus may become too slow. So right now, it's kind of got 2 halves. The bottom half is for the slag return, and that's only relevant for setups that actually produce slag. And the reason why it's 3 belts is because there's really only space for 3 to go through, and we need this extra space right here to insert the new stuff. So it's possible that we could become overloaded on slag, but luckily, since there's so many warehouses, these could all act as buffers to prevent things from getting full. But of course, another thing is that when we have cobalt, we can do blue belts, which would fix a lot of problems. But I'm hesitant to change that until it actually becomes a real problem, because the amount of effort it's going to take to like move all these belts around just to add like 2 more lanes of something sounds excessive, especially when the lanes that we're adding are for the least efficient ore production methods. Like, I really don't want to do that. And the further you go in your ore processing journey, the less slag you end up having. So you get 1 out of 4 slag for the first tier, and then it's 1 out of 6 slag for the second tier, 1 out of 8 for the third tier, and tier 4 you get nothing. It's still a mixture of ores, but you get no slag at all, which is in part why I have these different methods, because if you only do things the very best way, you will have 0 slag because you're not producing any, because you're being super efficient. And that slag is required to keep the process running, so you kind of need it to an extent. So we may not need to bother with this because our slag output might actually be decreasing. You can see that if every one of these was running, it would completely trash this bus here, which only has 8 slots. And the reason why it has 8 slots is because it's a multiple of 2, and it's just easy to use with just basic splitters. That if we wanted more, we couldn't really do like 10. because it would be a weird number and it wouldn't mesh very well. So we would either need to do a ton of warehouse balancers or go up to 16 essentially, which just sounds nuts. But one other thing to consider when it comes to these belts is that the most efficient methods have bypasses. So we've been using silicon as an example, that the most efficient method of making silicon never goes on the ore bus. It skips under it and goes straight into its storage warehouse. So the only things that actually get put on this ore bus are the second best ways and lower. And that's kind of an important thing to continue. Because you see all these warehouses in the beginning are sorted in such a way where the very best way of producing an ore is underneath. And then after that, we've kind of created all the ores. And then here's some secondary ways. And then we had our next tier of ores. So we have the warehouses here and then no more because these are the secondary ways again. And whenever you place them, you want to make sure that the best way of making something and its associated warehouse, because it's skipping the bus, is first. So everything that's upstream can come down and get sucked in. So like if any methods of making silver were down here, they would never make it to this point unless there was like a huge loop back. And of course it would have to be like 8 belts to make a giant like sushi belt of ore basically. That it's more trouble than it's worth. So it's much better to just kind of set it up like this. So we need to place 4 of these, and we don't need to leave a ton of space. We can line it up with the bottom of the bus there. And robots are going to have some trouble reaching, but we want to leave some space because it's possible at some point we're going to need more belts to come through here. So we don't really want to like completely smash it in. So, I don't know, something like that. And logistics zone expander 2. Oh, that's like barely in the way. Well, inventory is trashed. Not even sure what to get rid of at this point, because we kind of need a lot of this stuff. Well, maybe now that I have my belts, I'll get rid of that giant request again. And kind of put them in there. But this should be good enough. So let's grab like that spot right there. There we go. Of course, there's robots here, so they're wasting all those belts that just had delivered, but oh well. That's so many charge ports. Okay, well, we've got the 1, so we need to continue it. 2 to 3 and to 4. Well, that's refreshing. It didn't quite hit yet because there were only 1 belt instead of 2. But that's definitely going to change when we have the next sorting types that use those hybrid catalysts, because then we're going to have titanium, gold, cobalt, and uranium to deal with. And because this is the most efficient method of creating these ores, it makes sense that those methods would be here. And since we would be doing 2 belts of each instead of 1, it would basically be this set of machines right here. But it would be kind of annoying to have a giant empty space here and later put machines in. So I think what I'm going to do is just place the machines like this now and have them be the less efficient sorting types. And because they're designed with gaps in the middle so they can be converted between the 2 types, that later, when we unlock that research, which is purple research, so it's not that far away, you see we have most of the research necessary, that we can convert these by changing the recipe and then just kind of moving the logic around. It is a little annoying having to do that, but it's better than the alternative, which is having to move a bunch of stuff that technically right now doesn't actually have to move. I would prefer to not move things until we actually have to. It's not necessarily being lazy or anything. I mean, part of it is. But most of it is there's so much stuff that you need to do in Factorio, and you have so many things that are on your list of things to do that you don't want to make it harder than it has to be. And moving setups around that don't need to be moved yet is like the very definition of giving yourself extra work. Because who knows, by the time we want to do those ores, we might decide to just move this somewhere else, or maybe move these somewhere else, and it won't even be necessary to deal with them anymore. So We'll just have to see. We do have some extra poles in here now. I do kind of want to put some of these in place just to give the robots some zone. But it actually looks like they mostly reached the whole thing by now. Although, I think we were alternating between setups that had a logistic zone in it and setups that didn't. It looks like this one just got a logistic zone just because. But we kind of need to do the same thing. And I'm not sure. It's kind of the problem with doing it this way and being OCD about it, is you want everything to be perfectly straight. It can be difficult sometimes, especially when there's different inserters, so this wouldn't even be in the same spot. But I think it's something like that. So the robots have power, and now that kind of covers everything, so we can just let the robots do their thing and it will eventually be covered. And we need to extend some of these bus lines here. Looks like I wasn't drawing them quite straight, but it is going to impact these machines a little bit. Oh, that power pole is almost where it needs to be. Okay, something like that. We have an idea for the lines now, where it's really just these two setups. It seems like the end goal of both of them is to create the light mud water. So, since we have access to better machines and modules, let's just see what this whole setup actually needs. 162 light mud water. Oh, there's some old pipes in here. Bronze pipes still. It looks like it creates some mud as a byproduct, which makes sense. That's what these setups do. Try to get rid of all of the extra little pipe bits. Kind of just leave those unhooked for now. Let's see, we've got a purified water that goes over there, but it looks like it's just skipping over things anyway, which is kind of funny. There's really no reason why it can't just continue along here, which saves having this. It's kind of just funny seeing all these old pipes in the factory still. Like it's like archaeology in kind of a way, where it shows you how old is a certain part of a factory. Well, what material were the pipes made out of? It kind of tells you. So the fact that they're bronze pipes, which is a whole 2 tiers lower than we have now, means that this stuff is old. And washing plant 2. So is that the highest tier washing plant? Yeah, I guess so. I was thinking we would have to upgrade them, but that's just how they are. But instead of having 2 machines, one for each side, we only need 1 line of machines here. Let's just pick a spot to do this. I don't know. Well, the pipes are on this side, so it kind of makes sense to also do it here rather than like on that other side. I'm not sure what would go here, of course. You never know what would go there until things go there, and then you're like, oh, I regret this. But then the mud water has to go in there, which ends that pipe. It needs to get its water, so we can disconnect this, and it looks like we still need to get the water hooked up to the setup now. So the way that makes the most sense. Actually, I'm kind of surprised the pipe doesn't just jump between here to hit each one, rather than being off to the side like this. Seems kind of a weird way of doing it. Maybe the pipe links weren't as good back then. Or just, I didn't think of it. One thing about Factorio, especially modded Factorio, is anytime you do anything, it's like right after you do it, or maybe 300 hours later, you look at it and you're like, oh man, I could have done this better. Why didn't I do that? It's been like this the whole time. But that is Factorio for you. So, can't get too mad about it. Just upgrade and continue. And then we can use the pipe length to push over here. And there's all these weird pipe colors in here now. It's kind of bothersome, but also I kind of don't want to mess with it. So, that connects the water between the left and the right again. There we go. We hear water flowing noises, which is always good news. Let's get these modules in here. We need to take care of the mud, which we can just hook up to this existing belt, because that's what it's there for. Let's see. Just to make this easy, we'll just come right here. And it's already partially filled, so we won't see it work at full speed, but there's our setup. It creates more than we need, 180, and we needed the 162. So that was fairly painless to move that around. So it would be nice to always give the bots more access to the factory there. Seems like there's not many parking spots in this exact area of the factory. So let's change that. And also give them some places to relax. There we go. Oh, that's that's annoying. So, if we pick this up and move it one square backwards, should fix it. There we go. Okay. Well, it looks like everything has placed since we were doing that, which is good. Well, we've got the hookups ready for the fluorite, so let's just get the settings now. And the settings is 500 for the Givolite chunks. And that's already set to Bopmodium, so we'll do Givolite just to be more than 500. And the signal should be coming through, and it is. And then the catalyst setting, hey, actually made a silicon request, is 750. So greater than 750. Wonder what the factory is actually doing. I guess we just used a tiny bit of it, enough to the point where we needed to, I guess, from making circuits or whatnot. It's been a while since I've actually taken a look at this just to make sure everything's working okay. And it basically seems like it is. It's nothing particularly exciting. Once it's all set up, it just kind of works. And slowly consuming the silicon. I have been happy with this setup as far as upgrading this in place, that it didn't really have any disasters. A lot of times when you take something that's in place, oh, we have a lot of ore right there we need to get rid of, 48k to take care of that later. That's a lot for robots. I think that's why I left that there, is because I didn't want to let robots have to do all of that. But is it in range though? It is though. Do I make robots do it? No. I'll be nice on them. But upgrading in place can always have some issues. We just ran out of power too. Distractions. There we go. That upgrading in place can have problems just because you have a factory that's, although it's fairly dormant right now, it still does stuff every once in a while, and it can be kind of frustrating when you tear things up thinking you'll have enough resources for the completion of the setup, and then you don't, and you're like, oh no, now what do I do? Luckily though, that hasn't really been a problem, that our upgrading in place has worked quite well. So here's just a request that it's quietly making that when it gets below 10,000, this turns on for the most efficient way. It goes a little lower for a little while, but then it gets in there, gets above 10,000, and then kind of stops. So that much is working rather nicely. So good news here. Oh, the robot's delivering pipes and things. So now that we have the logic in place, this should run, but it'll only run to the point of getting to the end because there's nothing on the end. But at least we'll make sure there's nothing obscenely wrong with it. It seems like it works. It takes a second for the bottleneck mod to update the circles now, because I have it set to a fairly conservative setting, so as the factory gets bigger, it just reduces the reaction time of these circles. They don't actually impact the factory. I think way back when, they actually did really kind of nuke the performance of the factory as it got bigger, but basically the mod can only check so many machines per tick, and it's limited to that. So as the factory gets bigger, it'll always consume the same amount of UPS, it's just, it takes longer. But that much seems to be running. Of course, we'll need to hook it up to where it needs to go, and it'll probably get its own warehouse since it's on the bus here. Probably should check to see that if fluorite is made from other sorting types. And it actually isn't. That's worth noting. Well, I say it isn't, but it actually is in the sense that if we process mineral sludge, we would get uranium, a tiny bit of thorium, and some fluorite. So we would get it from that way, but otherwise, this is the only sorting method. But for convenience of getting the ore in here later, we'll probably want to have something similar where it has a sorting setup like this that pulls it off the bus. That's just what I was thinking about, but... Well, it's kind of a funny look to it. A lot of yellow and green in that particular line. But it worked. So now we need to connect everything else and create the input logic for it. Although the input logic is actually quite easy, because when it comes to processing these ores, the tier 3s, this is the only way to process them until we have access to the hybrid catalyst. So what it means is that any available ore can go straight in. It doesn't need to have an input condition. And I don't know if I've talked about it before, basically the concept behind this, but whenever you want to control a setup, there's kind of two different ways of controlling it. You can control the input that goes into a set of machines, and you can control the output that goes out. And if you want to have the maximum level of control over a factory, then any given line would actually have both an input control and an output control. So the output control here is basically just looking at the different levels of ores, and as the levels in the warehouses go down, it turns on the less desirable methods. And then on the input side, it's just looking to see if those ores are available. And it's like, why have two different controls in the same machine? Well, it's because they're not linked. The ores that you need, like, let's say copper, your need for copper is not linked to your availability of, let's say, stereotype, or even stereotype chunks. They're two separate things. They're related in that they go into each other, but the things that slow down copper production is the lack of stereotype, while the things that slow down stereotype is not necessarily the lack of stereotype. It can be, if there's no stereotype on the bottom, but it could be other things. It can be the lack of acids, or it could be it's overloaded on stone. So that's kind of why on really critical setups that there's controls for both the input and the output. So you see right now we are making a small amount of silicon, and it's being controlled at the top. But what happens if we didn't have any crystal catalysts and they were being used elsewhere? This would shut off. And then this method would stop because there's better things. So it's like when you have a complicated factory, that if you just control the input and the output for every set of machines that you have, you'd be surprised how much finesse you can have on the factory without actually having a crazy circuit network. Like this circuit network here for these ores is completely separate from this one up here. And earlier I talked about having a circuit network for these setups as well, and ultimately decided it wasn't necessary just because it seemed too granular and too micromanaging, that it seemed like it would work fine on its own. But I've had a lot of success with this method, and you see that really when it comes down to it, there's not that many controls. Most of these setups only have one control that sets them up with no combinators. In fact, I think that zinc here is the only one that actually has two different controls on it. And the outputs depends on how many output resources there are, but still it's only a turn on or turn off type of system. So you'd be surprised what you can accomplish with just a few wires, even without combinators. But even a few combinators can accomplish quite a bit. So the reason why I didn't use combinators here is because I figured why bother when we can just do little wires here, although there is a slight potential problem here, and I mentioned it before, where this one is controlled by the bobmonium level, and this one is controlled by the givolite level. But what happens if givolite isn't high enough, but bobmonium is? then this will run, and the few resources that are in this square will move forward. And that's not necessarily a problem, but what happens if occasionally the Givelite chunk activated and occasionally the Bobmonium chunk activated, and these kept kind of turning on and off sporadically? It would sporadically allow resources to go through when in reality they were never really on to begin with. That's kind of a problem with having controls in series like this. So a way around it is just with a combinator. I was thinking, it's more work than it's necessary. But at the same time, that's the only line that we have that actually has 2 control requirements on the same belt. So I didn't want to have to put combinators on every single setup and kind of make it more trouble than it's worth. But if it's only one line right here, I actually kind of want to put the combinators on there just to make it a tiny bit better, that whenever doing anything, I try to think, what's the cost of doing this and what's the benefit of doing this? And if it's only one line, I think the cost is fairly low. And, well, the benefit's low too, but the cost is low, which is almost more important. So we could put a combinator here. Just plop it in. And put 2 of them. 1 for each. So let's just do the left one, since it's on the left, as a Givelite. So Givelite needs to be more than 250. If so, green square. And the other one is Bobmonium is more than 500. It gets a green square. So let's unhook these for a second. I guess it doesn't matter. I don't really have to, because it's not like things are really going to run. Put these in. So each one is good. And then we have the green wire coming out. And then kind of hopping over there. And now each one is sending a green signal. So instead of requiring the individual resources, we'll just say the green signal has to be equal to 2. So both have to be true. And they are. So now they're connected, and that problem of them letting a few resources in at a time is no longer there. I don't know how much of a problem it would have actually ended up being, but I figured might as well do that since I'm thinking about it and it doesn't really require that much effort. And that's the end of this episode. On the next one, we're going to finish up with the setup, test it out, and get it ready for the logic that will control it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.